This week, we are going to be talking about how we can better serve Hispanic children and families. And this week, I chose one specific topic that I thought would be particularly relevant as we think about better serving Hispanic children and their families, and that is the topic of bilingualism, especially given the high numbers of Spanish speaking children and students and families that we have within the state of California, but also throughout the world and even within the US. So, as I go through what research and what the scholars say about languages and how we can better educate children in languages, this could also be applied to families that are non-Hispanic, right? But other ethnically diverse children and families who speak more than one language. Okay, so just know that it could be applicable beyond Hispanic families and children as well. So let's start with some of the numbers on why this is even important. It might go without saying that we have a very large number of English language learners, even within the US. In fact, this map of the US, we see different shades of blue. The darker the shade, the more diverse we have in terms of the population in their language that they speak. Okay, so darker than the higher percentage of English language learners we have in that state. California is one of the darker blue ones, which shows that we have a high percentage of English language learners, those who perhaps may have grown up learning a different non-English language. For myself, that's Korean, right? And then learned maybe English later on through schooling. Some more numbers: about 22.8% of public school enrollment in California consists of English language learners. That's about a fifth of all of our students, and that's more than 1 million of English language constituting the 22.3% of the total enrollment in California public schools. And more than 2.5 million students actually speak a language other than English at home. Okay, so they might be English language learners, or they may be fluent in English but also speak a different language at home as well. And so if we count all of that together, that 2.5 million students who have learned diverse languages other than English, that constitutes, almost 50% of our public school enrollment. So why am I sharing this? I'm sharing this just to say that this is a very much an important issue to think about if we are to think about how we want to raise our kids and how we want to educate them. This question of what do we do about language? What do we do about home language, right, in a diverse society? I want to talk a little bit about how early this starts. Okay, it starts early, right? You may have learned through different classes, your own life experiences, that infants are sponges, right? They pick up sound, words really quickly. There's this term called phonology, which is basically the sound of certain letters or words. And basically, one study looked at Hindi and Nithlakpamux, sorry for my lack of being able to pronounce that word, infants. And basically, what they found was that there is indeed a sensitive or critical period for learning languages. And that's the idea that children should be exposed to language early in life so that they can master it, right? Some people think, oh, you can learn it anytime. That's potentially true. But what we find through research is that there is a sensitive period that is kind of the sweet spot of when children can actually ideally learn languages in terms of their grammar, the sound, pronunciation, in the quickest and most efficient and best way possible, right? So in this study, basically, they looked at 6 to 8 months old, 8 to 10 months old, 10 to 12 months old infants. And what they found was that infants aged 1 to 4 months, okay, even earlier than that, were sensitive to meaningful sound or phonetic differences that occur in languages other than their own. In other words, they can better discriminate distinctions in foreign language sounds than their parents, at least for about 6 months. Okay, so the earlier um, or the younger the child or infant is, the more sensitive they are to different sound differences. Okay, but then gradually over the first year, as you see in this graph, with the bar graphs getting smaller and smaller, infants lost their ability to become specialists in listening for distinctions that occur in languages that they hear on a regular basis. In other words, they became more or less sensitive to sound differences over time. And then the figure shows that English hearing infants' ability to discriminate sound declined over time. And then within the 10 to 12-month old infants, you see that their performance was much less well than the 6 to 8 month infants. Okay, in other words, they could discriminate between different sounds not as well as the younger infants. And then in contrast, if you look at these 11-month-old Hindi and Nithlapamics infants, they were perfectly able to make the relevant distinctions in their native language, right? So that's kind of the comparison group. So it kind of makes us think, okay, the earlier, possibly, the better, right? Or the more ideal language learning might be. Not to say that you can't ever learn it later on or that's not the better way, okay? But to say that there's something going on in the earlier years that make us more naturally inclined to learn languages. A little bit more to add to this idea of sensitive period is the story of Jeannie. Now, this is a little bit of a, I guess, disturbing story, just to give you a little bit of a trigger alert. I'm bringing this story up because it adds to the idea that maybe we have to pay attention to bringing in language earlier in life than later. So, Jeannie's story began 20 months after her birth in 1957, and believing that Jeannie was mentally retarded, Clark Wiley locked his daughter, Jeannie, away, separating her from her nearly blind mother and 6-year-old brother under the guise of protecting her. Okay, so he locked her away and he spoon fed her only pablum and milk and spoke to her mostly in barks and growls. He beat her with a wooden paddle every time she uttered a sound. So you can think about what that would do to her, right? To discourage her from developing and growing, right? Then in 1970, Jeannie's 50-year-old mother, Irene, escaped with Jeannie, then 13. And basically, the mother and child turned up at the welfare offices in LA seeking financial support. And caseworkers noticed that Jeannie was a little odd, right? She spat and clawed and moved in jerky bunny walk sort of ways with her hands. You can see in the picture as well that she would walk kind of like, do a bunny walk with her hands up front. And the story continues, right? After they found her, she was entered into the children's hospital at age 14. Still in diapers, okay, mind you. Jeannie was the size of an 8-year-old with the language and motor skills of a baby, speaking only a few words, including stop it and no more. Less than 20 words at onset. So basically, not speaking with the fluency of a typical 14-year-old, and probably likely because of the environment that she was placed in, right? Very deprived of physical language, interaction, emotional connection, and whatnot. So Jeannie often made her needs known by gesturing and other means, and she loved being stroked and hugged and learned to hug back, according to people who worked there. And then when she was upset, at first she had a tearless cry, but eventually she began to show her emotion clearly. So they were able to work through some of her developmental delays, right? And then later on, people began to believe and wonder if Jeannie and her situation shows that kids can't learn language after puberty. In some ways, Jeannie disproved this idea, right? Because she passed the critical period of early on, but and she was able to make some improvements, but at the same time, she was never able to master grammatical structure of sentences, right? And so, because of this study, doctors now know that grammatical development actually needs some sort of stimulation from the environment. And she was readmitted to the hospital in 1977 for 2 weeks and was able to describe in sign language. And this is very sad, right? How her foster parents had punished her for vomiting. And after that incident, Jeannie never regained her speech. And she is said to be living in a privately run facility for 6 to 8 mentally underdeveloped adults. Okay, so very sad, sad story. But what we can learn from this story is that there are sensitive periods where language really needs that external input. And if that doesn't happen, human beings are very resilient and they'll recover. But then at the same time, you might miss out on, really, really flourishing that child in terms of their language. And there are aspects like grammatical development that might be very hard to recover later on.